The shy, rejected Omega hid at ceremony, until the Alpha King whispered Omega's name. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Emily Carter stood exactly where she had been told to stand, at the very edge of the ceremonial hall, where torchlight softened into shadow and the marble floor felt colder beneath her thin shoes, the kind of cold that crept upward and reminded her to stay still, to stay small, to stay unnoticed. The ceremony had already begun, and the air carried the scent of polished wood, winter pine, and restrained anticipation, the kind that made every breath feel measured. Omegas lined the center aisle in carefully chosen gowns, their names announced one by one, their shoulders straight, their chins lifted as if confidence itself were part of the ritual, but Emily had no place among them. She was the rejected one, the Omega whose bond had failed before it ever fully formed, the one her pack preferred to forget rather than explain. So she kept her gaze lowered, hands folded gently at her waist, counting the steady rhythm of her heartbeat and listening to the echo of footsteps that were never meant for her. She remembered the instructions whispered sharply to her before the doors opened. Do not speak, do not move forward, do not draw attention, and above all, do not hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope was what made the fall hurt worse. As the names continued to be called, polite applause rose and fell like distant waves, and Emily felt herself fading further into the background. A quiet presence pressed between towering pillars and trailing banners, her existence acknowledged by no one, questioned by no one, and that was supposed to be safer. Yet beneath the practiced calm on her face, something uneasy stirred, a subtle awareness she could not explain, as if the room itself were slowly shifting its focus. Then the hall changed. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't sudden, but it was absolute. Conversations thinned, breaths paused, and a heavy stillness settled as the Alpha King entered. Alexander Wolf moved with unhurried certainty, his presence measured and controlled, the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself. Emily did not look up, but she felt it anyway, a pressure in the air, a pull low in her chest that made her fingers tense before she consciously relaxed them again. She told herself it was nothing, just nerves, just imagination, but the sensation persisted, steady and unmistakable. Somewhere beyond her line of sight, the Alpha King's attention shifted, not toward the center where tradition demanded it rest, but outward, toward the margins, toward the place where Emily stood holding her breath. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the strange certainty that something had already noticed her, something that saw past the careful invisibility she had perfected. She remained still, eyes down, unaware that the quiet space she occupied had become the most important place in the room. Emily had learned long ago how to disappear in plain sight, and as the ceremony continued she slipped deeper into that familiar quiet, her breathing shallow, her shoulders relaxed just enough to avoid notice, even as her senses remained alert to every shift in the room. The Alpha King's presence lingered like a low current, steady and undeniable, and though she did not dare look directly at him, she could feel the weight of his awareness moving through the hall, slow and deliberate, as if he were listening for something no one else could hear. The names of the other Omegas were announced with practiced formality, each voice echoing off the high stone ceiling, each introduction followed by polite approval, yet none of it touched Emily. She stood apart, an afterthought pressed into shadow, reminding herself that this was how it was meant to be. She told herself that rejection was easier when it stayed quiet, when no one bothered to acknowledge it. A nearby attendant shifted, casting a brief glance her way, then quickly looking elsewhere, and Emily felt that old, familiar sting, the subtle confirmation that she did not belong in the center of things. She had been brought here out of obligation, nothing more, a formality that would end the moment the ceremony concluded. Her pack leader had made that very clear, his tone firm but detached, as though she were a loose detail to be managed rather than a person with a place. As the minutes passed, Emily focused on the small details that helped keep her grounded, The faint flicker of torchlight against the banners, the cool air brushing her cheeks, the steady marble beneath her feet, measured and unchanging. She reminded herself that once the Alpha King made his selections, she would slip away unnoticed, return to the quiet margins where expectations were lower and disappointment was easier to bear. Yet the pull in her chest refused to fade. It was not fear, and it was not hope, but something in between, a subtle awareness that made her pulse quicken whenever the room felt too still. She sensed movement, not toward the center aisle, but toward the edges, and her fingers tightened briefly before she forced them to relax again. She kept her gaze down, even as the space around her seemed to narrow, as if the hall itself were drawing a line between what had been invisible and what could no longer be ignored. Somewhere nearby, voices softened, footsteps slowed, and Emily felt an unmistakable shift, a pause that did not belong to the ceremony's careful rhythm. She was aware of her own name then, not spoken aloud, but present in her thoughts, heavy and fragile all at once, a reminder of who she was beneath the labels that had followed her for years. Emily Carter, the Omega who had learned to endure without being seen. She swallowed, steadying herself, certain that whatever was happening had nothing to do with her, and yet unable to dismiss the sense that the air itself had changed. The Alpha King had stopped moving. The awareness settled deep, quiet but absolute, and Emily stood frozen in her place, unaware that the distance between shadow and center had already begun to close, not through command or ceremony, but through something far more personal and far more dangerous than she was prepared to understand. Emily became increasingly aware of how sharply she contrasted with the scene unfolding at the center of the hall, where confidence was displayed like fine fabric and voices carried without hesitation, while she remained tucked away in quiet restraint. The other Omegas shifted forward when prompted, their movements graceful and assured, trained for moments like this, and Emily watched their reflections flicker across polished stone, careful not to follow them with her eyes for too long. She had learned that attention, even borrowed attention, came with consequences. A subtle murmur passed through the gathering as another name was announced, followed by approving nods and measured smiles, and Emily felt the familiar sense of separation settle deeper into her bones. She was present, yet not included, acknowledged only by the space she did not occupy. Somewhere behind her, fabric rustled, and a low voice murmured a reminder that she should remain where she was, and Emily inclined her head slightly in response, signaling compliance without words. She told herself that this was temporary, that once the formalities ended she would leave quietly, return to the routines that asked little of her and offered even less in return. Still, the awareness from earlier lingered, the feeling that the room had not fully released its attention from her direction. She sensed eyes shifting, not openly, but cautiously, as if curiosity were beginning to edge past indifference. The Alpha King had not resumed moving, and that stillness pressed against Emily's awareness, making her breathing shallow despite her efforts to remain composed. She focused on the slow passage of time, counting heartbeats, listening to the cadence of announcements, anything to anchor herself in the familiar. Yet the longer the pause stretched, the more the silence seemed to bend around her, shaping itself into something heavier, something expectant. She felt exposed without being seen, the quiet scrutiny far more unsettling than open judgment ever had been. A nearby Omega glanced toward the shadows briefly, her expression flickering with confusion before she looked away again, and Emily's chest tightened in response. She shifted her weight slightly, careful not to draw attention, her fingers brushing the seam of her sleeve as she steadied herself. The ceremony was meant to follow a predictable pattern, yet the rhythm had faltered, and with it, Emily's certainty that she would remain untouched by the evening's outcome. She sensed movement then, measured and deliberate, closing a distance she had not realized existed, and the awareness sent a ripple through her nerves. The hall felt smaller, the air warmer, as if the space between presence and absence were narrowing. Emily did not raise her head, but she no longer felt hidden. The Alpha King's attention, once diffuse and distant, seemed focused now, intent without being forceful, and the realization made her pulse quicken despite her best efforts to remain calm. She wondered briefly what he could possibly see in the margins of his own ceremony, what had drawn his notice away from the expected and toward the overlooked. The thought unsettled her, not because she wished to be noticed, but because some part of her sensed that this attention, once given, could not easily be withdrawn. She remained still, composed in appearance if not in spirit, unaware that the contrast she embodied, quiet against grandeur, had already set something irreversible into motion. The ceremony resumed its surface rhythm, yet something fundamental had shifted, and Emily felt it in the subtle way the air seemed to tighten around her, as though the hall itself were holding its breath. The Alpha King moved again at last, his steps unhurried, each one measured with intent rather than spectacle, and although he did not face her directly, Emily sensed his trajectory with an instinct she did not question. Conversations softened, attendants adjusted their posture, and even those accustomed to power seemed careful not to draw attention to themselves as he passed. Emily remained where she was, shoulders squared but relaxed, her gaze still lowered in quiet compliance, telling herself that this was coincidence, that she was imagining meaning where none existed. Yet the awareness persisted, steady and calm, not pressing but present, like a tide that had already turned. She became conscious of the smallest details, the faint sound of fabric brushing stone, the warmth of torchlight against her cheek, the gentle shift of her own weight as she balanced herself. The Alpha King paused several feet away, close enough that Emily could sense the subtle change in the space between them, a difference that did not require sight to recognize. She felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with appearance, as though something intrinsic had drawn his attention and refused to let go. Around them, the ceremony continued, names announced, approvals granted, yet those sounds felt distant, secondary to the quiet that had settled between shadow and presence. Emily's heart beat steadily now, no longer racing, grounded by a strange calm she could not explain. She had spent years learning to endure being overlooked, to accept the safety of invisibility, and yet in that moment she understood that being unseen had never truly protected her. The Alpha King's attention was not intrusive or demanding, but it carried weight, and Emily sensed that it was deliberate, chosen rather than accidental. She wondered briefly what he expected to find at the edge of his own ceremony, what had drawn him away from tradition and toward the quiet margins where she stood. She did not dare look up, not yet, trusting her instincts to guide her through unfamiliar ground. The space between them remained intact, respectful, but charged with unspoken recognition, and Emily felt the delicate balance of it settle into place. Nearby, an attendant shifted as if to intervene, then hesitated, clearly uncertain, and Emily realized with a start that the usual rules were no longer sufficient to explain what was happening. The Alpha King did not command attention with raised voice or gesture, yet his stillness redirected the focus of the room more effectively than any proclamation could have. Emily remained silent, her composure steady, even as the sense of inevitability grew stronger. She had not stepped forward, had not asked to be acknowledged, yet she felt herself standing at the threshold of something she had never allowed herself to imagine. The quiet between them stretched, unbroken, and Emily understood that whatever came next would not be a matter of ceremony or obligation, but of choice, and that realization settled into her chest with surprising clarity. She remained in shadow, but no longer unseen, and as the Alpha King stood nearby, attentive and unhurried, Emily sensed that the distance she had relied on for so long was already beginning to dissolve. Emily felt the connection before she understood it, a quiet resonance that settled beneath her ribs and spread outward with steady warmth, not overwhelming but impossible to ignore. The Alpha King had not spoken, yet the space between them felt carefully bridged, as if an invisible thread had been drawn taut and left there to hum. She kept her gaze lowered, eyelashes resting against her cheeks, listening to the subtle cadence of his breathing and the distant continuation of the ceremony that no longer seemed centered where it should have been. The pull did not demand her attention, it invited it, and that difference mattered more than she could have explained. She had known pressure before, expectation and judgment, and the constant weight of being measured against standards she could not meet, but this felt nothing like that. This was recognition without requirement, awareness without insistence. Emily's hands relaxed at her sides, fingers uncurling as the tension she had carried for years eased just enough to let her breathe more fully. She wondered if the Alpha King sensed it too, the quiet alignment that did not rely on scent or ceremony, something deeper and steadier than instinct alone. Around them, the hall continued to move, attendants guiding participants, voices rising and falling, yet the moment between shadow and presence remained intact, untouched by interruption. Emily became aware of the subtle ways attention shifted nearby, how people adjusted their stance as if responding to a change they could feel but not identify. The Alpha King remained composed, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, and Emily sensed that his focus was not accidental. She felt no urge to flee, no need to retreat further into the margins, and that realization surprised her more than anything else. She had spent so long preparing herself to endure that she had never considered the possibility of being chosen without being tested. Her heart beat evenly now, grounded by the strange certainty that she was not mistaken, that this connection was real, even if it was unspoken. She lifted her chin slightly, not enough to meet his gaze, but enough to acknowledge the space they shared, and the response was immediate, a subtle shift in the air that told her she had been noticed all the same. The Alpha King did not step closer, did not gesture or command, yet his attention remained steady, patient, as if giving her the time she needed to understand what was unfolding. Emily felt a flicker of something she had long kept guarded, not hope exactly, but possibility, and she held it carefully, unwilling to let it grow reckless. She reminded herself that ceremonies ended, that roles were enforced, that the world did not change simply because something felt different in a single moment. Yet even as she cautioned herself, the connection held, unwavering, and Emily sensed that it was not bound by the structure of the evening. She became aware of her own name again, not as a label tied to rejection, but as something complete and intact, belonging wholly to her. Emily Carter, present and accounted for, not because she had demanded recognition, but because it had been given freely. The Alpha King's attention did not waver, and Emily understood with quiet clarity that whatever followed would not erase her past, but it would redefine what came next. She remained in place, composed and calm, feeling the unseen pull settle into certainty, aware that the distance between them was no longer a barrier but a deliberate choice, one that would be crossed only when the moment was right. The fragile equilibrium shifted when a quiet murmur rose nearby, subtle at first, then edged with concern, and Emily sensed the change even before it touched her directly. An attendant stepped closer to the shadowed edge of the hall, posture polite but uncertain, eyes flicking between Emily and the Alpha King as if searching for permission that had not been given. Emily's awareness sharpened, the old instinct to withdraw resurfacing as she recognized the familiar pattern of scrutiny, the moment when deviation was corrected and order reasserted. She felt the weight of being out of place press against her again, not as judgment, but as procedure, and the distinction did little to ease the tension gathering in her chest. The attendant spoke softly, the words meant to guide rather than accuse, reminding her that participants were expected to remain within designated areas, that the ceremony followed rules older than any single presence within it. Emily inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the instruction without protest, prepared to step back further into shadow if that was what was required. She had done it before, countless times, yielding ground without being asked to explain herself. Yet before she could move, the air shifted once more, not abruptly, but decisively, and the attendant hesitated, the words trailing off unfinished. Emily felt it then, the quiet intervention that did not rely on command or display. The Alpha King did not raise his voice or make a gesture, yet his attention settled with unmistakable clarity, and the attendant's uncertainty deepened into stillness. Emily remained where she was, heart steady despite the tension, sensing that the familiar outcome she had anticipated was no longer inevitable. Around them, awareness spread, subtle but undeniable, as others noticed the pause and the unresolved moment hanging between expectation and authority. Emily felt exposed again, but this time the exposure carried a different weight, not isolating but connective, as though her presence mattered in a way it never had before. The attendant withdrew a half step, offering a respectful nod before retreating, and Emily exhaled slowly, surprised by the steadiness of her own response. She had not spoken, had not defended herself, yet the boundary had held. The Alpha King's attention remained focused, not on the disruption, but on her, patient and unwavering, as if acknowledging that tension was not something to be avoided, but something to be navigated. Emily became aware of the way others were watching now, not openly, but with restrained curiosity, their assumptions quietly rearranging themselves in response to the subtle assertion that had just occurred. She did not meet their gazes, choosing instead to remain grounded in the quiet certainty she felt between herself and the Alpha King. The ceremony continued around them, but its rhythm felt altered, as though a new measure had been introduced without announcement. Emily sensed the vulnerability of the moment, the knowledge that recognition invited challenge as readily as it invited protection, and she held herself steady, unwilling to retreat simply because the ground beneath her had shifted. She understood that this tension was not a threat, but a test, one that asked whether she would continue to exist only at the margins or accept the space that had been opened for her. The Alpha King's presence did not waver, offering no reassurance beyond attention itself, and Emily found that it was enough. She remained still, composed, aware that whatever came next would require her to stand where she was, not hidden, not centered, but unmistakably present. The moment arrived without announcement, slipping into the space between breaths, and Emily sensed it before any sound marked its presence. The Alpha King stepped closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough that the warmth of his proximity registered, steady and calm, and the quiet between them deepened into something deliberate. The hall seemed to recede, its noise dimming as attention narrowed, and Emily felt the world draw inward to a single, focused point. She kept her eyes lowered, aware of the subtle shift in the air, the unmistakable sense that whatever was about to happen was meant only for her. The Alpha King inclined his head slightly, the gesture restrained yet intimate, and she felt the careful consideration behind it, the patience of someone accustomed to choosing his moments rather than seizing them. She felt no fear, only a heightened awareness that made every sensation clearer, the steady cadence of her heartbeat, the faint scent of winter pine, the smooth coolness of the stone beneath her feet. His voice, when it came, was low and measured, not intended to carry beyond the narrow space they shared, and the sound of it settled gently against her senses. He spoke her name, quietly, precisely, as if it were something to be handled with care. Emily. The sound of it in his voice sent a subtle tremor through her, not because it was loud or commanding, but because it was exact, unmistakable, chosen. Her name had been spoken countless times before, often with impatience or dismissal, but this was different. It was recognition distilled into a single word, acknowledgement without condition or expectation. Emily's breath caught briefly before she steadied it again, the response instinctive rather than deliberate, and she felt the weight of that whisper settle into her chest with surprising solidity. The Alpha King did not repeat himself, did not elaborate or explain, trusting the moment to speak for itself, and Emily understood that nothing more was required. Around them, the hall had gone still, though few could have said exactly why, only that something essential had shifted. Emily did not look up right away, allowing the reality of what had just occurred to register fully, the quiet certainty that she had been seen, named, and acknowledged in a way that could not be undone. When she finally lifted her gaze, just enough to meet his, she found no expectation there, only calm assurance and a depth of attention that did not waver. She felt exposed and grounded all at once, the familiar urge to retreat tempered by a new understanding that retreat was no longer her only option. The Alpha King straightened slightly, giving her space even as the connection held, and Emily sensed that the whisper had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had drawn a line no one else could cross, marked not by decree or ceremony, but by recognition. She remained where she was, posture steady, shoulders relaxed, feeling the quiet aftershock ripple through her awareness as others slowly realized that something irreversible had taken place. The Alpha King's presence did not linger longer than necessary, his restraint as deliberate as his approach, and yet the space he left behind felt changed, charged with meaning that extended beyond the ceremony itself. Emily stood in that altered space, her name echoing softly in her thoughts, no longer a reminder of rejection, but a declaration of presence. She understood then that the whisper was not an ending, but an opening, and that whatever followed would unfold from this moment of quiet recognition that had reshaped everything without raising a single voice. The quiet that followed the whisper spread outward, subtle yet unmistakable, and Emily felt it settle over the hall like a held breath finally acknowledged. No announcement followed, no formal declaration to guide the gathering back into familiar order, yet everyone sensed that the moment had passed a point of return. The Alpha King stepped back with unhurried composure, granting her space without withdrawing his attention, and the balance of that restraint steadied Emily more than any reassurance could have. She remained where she was, no longer hidden by shadow, but not thrust into the center either, occupying a place that felt newly defined. Around her, the ceremony resumed in careful fragments, voices lowered, movements precise, as if the room were testing a revised set of rules. Emily noticed the way glances shifted, no longer dismissive, no longer indifferent, but measured with a curiosity tempered by caution. The usual assumptions did not fit as neatly as they once had, and she felt the subtle recalibration taking place without a single word being spoken. An attendant passed nearby and offered a respectful nod, brief and restrained, yet different from before, and Emily returned it with quiet composure, surprised by how natural it felt to acknowledge rather than retreat. She felt grounded in her own body, her breathing even, her posture relaxed, the lingering echo of her name still present, not demanding, simply affirming. The Alpha King took his place again among the ceremony's structure, his presence anchoring the hall as it found its rhythm once more, and Emily sensed that the attention he had given her had not diminished with distance. It remained, steady and watchful, not as possession, but as recognition that did not require proximity to endure. She felt no urge to follow him, no need to claim more than had been offered, understanding intuitively that restraint was part of the meaning of what had occurred. The ceremony moved toward its conclusion, selections formalized, roles acknowledged, yet Emily remained apart from the expected outcomes, neither dismissed nor claimed, and that in itself marked a profound shift. She felt a quiet confidence settle into her awareness, not the brittle confidence borrowed from approval, but something sturdier, rooted in the knowledge that she had been seen without needing to prove herself. When the final formalities began to wind down, Emily noticed the subtle way the room oriented itself around the Alpha King's movements, and she recognized the pattern now with clearer eyes. Power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply adjusted the world around it, until resistance fell away. She felt no triumph, no desire for spectacle, only a calm certainty that her presence mattered in ways she was still learning to understand. As people began to disperse, conversations resuming in careful tones, Emily remained composed, attentive to the space she occupied, aware that it was no longer defined by absence. She understood that the path ahead would not be effortless, that recognition invited scrutiny as readily as it invited respect, yet she felt prepared in a way she never had before. The Alpha King cast a final glance in her direction, brief and assured, and Emily met it with quiet steadiness, acknowledging the connection without reaching for more. She knew then that whatever followed would unfold deliberately, not rushed by expectation or fear. The ceremony ended, but the meaning of what had taken place lingered, and Emily stood in the aftermath, fully present, no longer defined by rejection, but by the simple, unalterable truth that she had been recognized, and that recognition had already begun to reshape her world. Emily remained in the hall long after most had drifted away, not because she was uncertain where to go, but because she wanted to understand what it felt like to stand in a place that no longer rejected her presence. The echoes of the ceremony faded into quiet footsteps and low voices, and the torches burned steadier now, their light less performative, more real. She took a slow breath and felt the calm settle deeper, not fragile or borrowed, but earned through the simple act of remaining where she had always been told she did not belong. The Alpha King had already departed through a side passage reserved for those whose movements reshaped schedules without announcement, yet his presence lingered, not as a shadow, but as a certainty Emily carried with her. She sensed that what had passed between them was not confined to a single evening or a single whisper. It had set something in motion that would unfold according to its own rhythm, not the one dictated by tradition or expectation. As attendants quietly cleared the remaining ceremonial details, one paused near Emily and offered guidance about the exit corridors, her tone respectful and unhurried. And Emily thanked her softly, surprised again by how natural it felt to be addressed without dismissal. She made her way toward the archway, steps measured, posture steady, aware that she was being observed not out of suspicion, but recognition. Outside, the night air was cool and clean, the stone courtyard lit by lanterns that cast long, gentle shadows. Emily paused at the top of the steps and looked up at the sky, where clouds drifted slowly across the moon, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel unburdened by the need to anticipate rejection. She did not imagine sudden change or effortless acceptance, but she understood that the narrative she had been given was no longer complete. Her name had been spoken with intention, and intention carried consequences. As she descended the steps, she became aware of movement at the far edge of the courtyard. A familiar presence felt rather than seen, and though she did not turn, she knew the Alpha King was there, observing from a respectful distance. He did not approach, did not summon her, allowing her the dignity of choice, and that restraint resonated more deeply than any command could have. Emily continued forward, feeling the quiet alignment between them hold without effort, a promise that did not require words to be understood. She recognized then that her future would not be shaped by avoidance or fear, but by the willingness to stand fully within her own presence. The world beyond the ceremony awaited, complex and demanding, yet she felt ready to meet it with clarity she had never known. The courtyard opened into a path leading back toward familiar grounds, and Emily followed it, steps sure, heart steady, carrying with her the knowledge that recognition had changed the way she would move through every space that followed. Behind her, the Alpha King turned away, satisfied not because he had claimed anything, but because he had seen and named what mattered. Emily did not look back. She did not need to. The night stretched ahead, full of quiet possibility, and she walked into it knowing that destiny had already begun, not with spectacle, but with the simple, irrevocable act of being seen.